Hi, my name is Jerry, and this is Pictures in Time.
What about some breakfast?
Sounds like a good idea. Where should we go?
Your apartment?
The other day, I stumbled across a movie called Airport. Not Airplane.
You ever seen a grown man naked?
Although they are sort of similar, but Airport. A 1970 movie about a hectic night at Lincoln International Airport. And I couldn't help but think, boy, they just don't make them like they used to.
Fun! We just don't have time.
I mean, don't get me wrong, the movie isn't great by any means. It has so many different little storylines, most of which just end up irrelevant or unresolved. But it still managed to stand out as a type of movie that you just don't see get made anymore. That style of filmmaking from the 40s, 50s, and 60s that seemed completely different from what you see today. So what was so different about these movies? Why go back and watch them? What made them unique? Obviously, there are a few smaller differences that stand out first. The Steadicam wasn't invented yet, so the cameras back then were usually on tripods and rarely moved. Also, most movies used a pretty standardized Technicolor process, which is why so many movies of the time looked so similar. There weren't as many popularized options. Then there was the music. The music back then was a lot more dramatic than what you see today, and because of this you heard a lot of brass instruments. And then there are the characters of the time, most of whom always appear to be on the crux of some sort of life-changing event. Take for example an airport. You got a manager on the brink of a divorce while sleeping with his secretary during a work emergency. You have a secretary who has to decide on a great job offer in another city, but is in love with her boss. You have a pilot who neglects any devotion to his wife after his mistress informs him she's pregnant with his child. You have a stewardess who finds out she's pregnant with a married man's baby before getting blown up by a bomb. And you have a sad terrorist who brings a bomb onto a plane and then blows himself up. Like a lot of movies of the time, it's capturing the climax of seemingly everyone's lives. And on top of these things, you have that manner of speaking that only characters back then seemed to have.
I didn't come here to talk about the future of aviation.
Well, you better start. And you better start looking ahead a few years.
While all of these things are interesting and different in their own right, we're missing something here. Something that is and was more impactful than arguably all of these things put together. What really sets these movies apart from what you see today, more than the cinematography or the music or the stories, is the acting.
Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine.
It's a very dramatic style of acting that's been slowly phased out throughout the course of cinema. But to explain why, we first have to ask, where did this style even come from? When talkies first began, actors took a lot of their inspiration from the exaggerated expressions of the silent era. But more than this, almost every actor of their time got their start in the theater.
Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? Anyway, my father didn't think so.
Over-the-top mannerisms, emphasis on certain words, and of course, these little speeches.
Because you'll never be a first-class human being or a first-class woman until you've learned to have some regard for human frailty.
When talkies first started, most of them were basically just filmed plays. A bunch of theater actors on a soundstage with lots of dramatic emphasis and a camera that was often placed where the audience would be sitting. What really stands out with this theatrical style is how much emotion and sentimentality the characters would display.
Well, they worked it out. I feel I ought to be able to do the same, or else I failed. And I don't like to fail.
Just like with a soliloquy, the actors would do everything they can to make their feelings known. And the writing would often complement this with dialogue that suited the situation. Like during a divorce, where both characters immediately analyze and articulate their positions perfectly.
I suppose I'm like a lot of men, a bigamist. Married to both a woman and a job.
And I can't be number two wife any longer.
It's kind of ridiculous to hear this dialogue now, but it's a common trope in these older movies. The characters get emotional, but are still articulate enough to convey exactly what they're feeling to the audience.
You think that will make them feel more secure? A broken home?
It's better to come from a broken home than to live in one.
Who among us doesn't wish we had this sort of insane self-awareness? It makes sense why this style didn't last. Eventually, people started seeing these characters for what they were.
A little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
Unrealistic. People obviously don't just start perfectly verbalizing how they feel about things, and they don't really ever act this animated either. With the 60s and 70s came a new wave of filmmaking, and as a result, a new wave of acting. It was around this time that actors stopped using theater training for movies, and instead started to focus on a style that better fit the medium.
I mean, I watch the series, I haven't missed the series in years, even in the cooler. When I'm in the cooler, they run it in there, they have a riot.
In short, they started to try to act, how people actually act.
I need your help about 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago? You never helped me.
Today, you still definitely get theatrical performances, but they're more toned down. And now, a lot of what we judge a performance on is how realistic it is. Where in the past, I can assure you, that was less of a concern.
At my first report card at school.
So then, what keeps people, myself included, coming back to these classics? Why do people love them? I think it's because of one simple reason. The characters are honest.
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. Instead of a bum, which is what I am.
Not necessarily honest with the people around them, they're honest with us. We know the deepest desires and truths of their hearts because they tell us.
Fella ain't got a soul of his own, just a little piece of a big soul. The one big soul that belongs to everybody.
There are a lot of great characters in modern cinema, but a lot of the time we don't really know who they are. We get hints and breadcrumbs, but in the end, they're an enigma to us. In some movies, this obviously works very well, but in others, it feels like we're missing out on something. And that's why these characters stand out.
Do you know how I feel?
How?
Proud.
We know exactly who they are. They show us through every bit of their acting, through their facial expressions and their intonations.
I'm Charles Foster Kane!
But even more so through what they choose to share with us.
But I am carrying someone who's part of us. I'm not so sure I want to lose it.
They show us their desires and what matters most to them.
You know, before you said that you thought I loved you just a little. You're wrong. I love you a lot more than just a little.
So when something good happens, we know how it affects them. It's always easier to sympathize with a person we know more about. It's not feasible to say we should return to this way of acting. People would think this style is over the top now, just like they started 250 years ago. But there are other techniques that can be used to achieve this same effect and see into the heart of a character. Some directors use flashbacks to see them in their youth, some use fantasies to show their true desires, and others use these same soliloquies but toned down, where the acting isn't so melodramatic.
1,100 men went into the water. Vessel went down in 12 minutes.
But you still get that insight of who a person is. The old theatrical way of acting may be gone, but the lesson we learn from it is timeless. To love or hate a character, it helps to know exactly who they are. They just don't make them like they used to is undeniably true. The Airport series, and I say series because they ended up making 3 sequels, was one of the last franchises of a dying race. It was the final hurrah to a now bygone era. And in some ways, the changes we've made since then have been for the better. Taking a step back from melodramatic music, melodramatic acting, and characters written like they're in plays have all probably been a step forward. Still, it's important to look back on these films and see what made them resonate with so many people to begin with. I still love them, and many of them are still some of my favorite movies to watch.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
And for good reason, too. Thanks for watching.